He was relieved to see that his logic stopped them temporarily. As firmly as he could, he stood up. The blood swooped down from his head and his knees sagged. He caught Burke's shoulder. "Ah, don't be a fool," Burke implored. Hale managed to shake his head. The temptation was enormous. He knew he needed a soft, clean bed, decent food, and medical attention. He wanted them so much. He pushed himself erect. "I'm all right now." He took off his pajama jacket and let it slide to the floor. Mrs. Burke stood by uncertainly. When Hale reached for the pants tape, she went outside. "Where are you going when you get out of here?" Burke pursued doggedly. Hale shrugged. "I have plans." Gently, Burke helped him pull his underwear jersey over his head. "Yeah, what kind?" "Business plans. I don't think it would be good luck to talk about them." "I think you're nuts. It's delirious you are." Bending over his shoes, Hale stopped short. There was a possibility, he had to admit. Then he grinned up at Burke and went on tying his laces. "Ridiculous!" He went back over his recent past. Methodically, he had outlined a course of action. Following it scrupulously, he had given up a 40-a-week job, a very secure one, with a chance of rising to 60 and retiring eventually on half pay. His fiancée had been outraged, naturally. Even so, she trusted his judgment and had hung on. Did he love her? Well, he had once. At least she had appealed to him. She was pretty, and she was nice. Maybe that was the trouble. Too nice. Girls like that come in droves. For a nice fellow, a nice girl, a nice job, a nice future, a nice home, nice children. But Hale couldn't be content with these things. He couldn't cut the coat of his ambition to fit his abilities. So he had conceived his bizarre plan. He had carefully taken his savings and bought the most worthless stocks he could find. For a while he had feared being duped into making a profit, but his plan had worked, and he had succeeded in selling out just before the stocks in question went up. The memory of that nervous time still made him sweat. But playing the market had accomplished two major objectives. His embarrassing savings were gone, and Loretto with them. It had been worth the anxiety. "All right," Mrs. Burke called through the door. "Yep, come on in," Hale answered cheerfully. She watched him writhe into his overcoat with obvious disapproval. Before he put his hat on, she looked encouragingly at her husband. "See here, Mr. Hale," Burke suddenly blurted. "We ain't exactly millionaires, but we got hearts." He held out a $5 bill. It was a tough moment for Hale. Instead of virtuously protesting, however, he drew several coins out of his own pocket, removed the single penny, and held out 3/4 to Mrs. Burke. "I know it doesn't repay you for the way you've taken care of me," he said clumsily. "But when I'm in a better position, I'll really make it up to you. Please take it." Mrs. Burke began to cry into her apron. "He's crazy," she wailed. 76 cents is all he's got in the world?" "I know, because that's the change I brought him when I got his medicine. And he wants to keep a penny and give me 75 cents? Burke looked shocked, moved determinedly toward Hale. "Take this. You're not leaving the house without it." "Please don't excite me," Hale gasped, retreating. "I can't take it. It would make me unhappy." His agitation persuaded Mrs. Burke to call off her husband. His goggling horror of being forced to take the money was real enough to have convinced anyone. Burke regretfully put the bill away. They stood around awkwardly. Hale, for all his peculiarities, lacked the consummate heartlessness to dash away abruptly, much as he wanted to be off. "What about your luggage?" Mrs. Burke asked huskily. Why, you're going to keep them, of course. I haven't paid my rent. Burke snapped his mouth closed. For several seconds he looked quite fierce, glowering with wounded pride at Hale. In the end, naturally, he was forced to open his mouth again to breathe. None of that now, he threatened. But it's your right to hold them, Hale protested. I don't care if it is. I won't. Hale thought quickly. Perhaps the idea of getting sick hadn't been so good. It raised too many unforeseen problems, like this one. He had counted on having the superintendent of whatever rooming house he landed in confiscate his belongings. Well, he said hopefully, how about keeping them until I can redeem them? Not a chance. Then until I call for them. Hale amended despairingly. I'm not strong enough to carry them around. Suspecting a trap, the Burkes hesitated, but at least agreed. But no nonsense now, said Mr. Burke. When you need anything, you come right here and get it. Certainly, you bet. It's awfully nice of you. He moved toward the door. Burke said, You can't go looking for a job like that. He took Hale's feeble arm and guided him to the tiny square of mirror hanging over the unsteady chest of drawers. It's like hell you look. See? Hale had to smile triumphantly, his face even better than he had hoped. Thin, haggard cheeks, feverishly bright dark eyes, the skin of his high forehead stretched tautly over his skull, his large broken nose jutting out of a tangle of black whiskers, his dry, thin hair standing up. He nodded at the reflection. Excellent, he thought. You can use my razor, Burke offered. Hale winced involuntarily. His stubble of beard was something to be observed at all cost. No thanks, he choked out. He couldn't risk more offers of help by waiting around. Mrs. Burke's mouth was trembling with some suggestion. Before it could come out, Hale squeezed Burke's shoulder, kissed Mrs. Burke's large cheek, and fled. On the street, he could feel really successful. The bitter wind slashed at him. He had only 76 cents and no place to sleep. He was getting somewhere. Chapter 2. Hale didn't stand indecisively on the cold street. It was not yet noon, and before nightfall he had a fairly rigid course of action to follow. His brown sport shoes felt like ton weights. He had been out of them for so long, and his overcoat dragged his shoulders down. He knew his temperature was over 100, but it did not affect his sharp reasoning. He felt the sheathed hunter's knife and the pistol in his overcoat pockets, and he smiled with amused anticipation. They were important. At the start of his campaign, he had selected them with care. But they would not be useful for several days, and then only to prove a point that might be debated. He walked over to 6th Avenue and turned downtown. At 59th Street he made the first cluster of men. He squeezed in among them. I don't feel despondent enough, he thought, analytically. I don't have the look of defeat. Not all the men in front of the employment agency were shabby. Some had been thrust down only recently. They glanced almost furtively at the job notices as if they were merely curious. But there were others whom Hale studied like an actor learning a role. They were the habitual prowlers of the agency, ragged, filthy, too close to starvation to be hungry, shuffling mechanically from hopelessness to indifference. Hale coveted that attitude. He thoughtfully set out to make himself despondent. How long would his 76 cents keep him? A dime for breakfast, 15 cents for lunch, a quarter for supper, 50 cents for one day, a quarter for a cheap hotel cot.